everybody. Good morning. You are welcome to this webinar, which is the October edition of our monthly workshop. It is a great pleasure to have you here on board. This event is hosted by Richflood International Limited, a leading continental provider of environmental and social due diligence services for investment in Africa. The topic for today's discussion is site investigation, risk assessment, and management. Faced with a trend toward more protective regulatory standards for growing list of contaminants and greater stakeholder focus on sustainability, organizations need to be able to quickly and effectively identify and address risk. Getting a clear understanding of the scope of the issues based on a comprehensive investigation and characterization using the latest technologies and tools is critical. However, site investigation programs are often necessarily protracted due to the use of traditional tools and techniques. For the site owner, this not only means higher cost and greater disruption, but also unreliable results. This workshop will help investors make smarter and faster decisions about contaminated site and risk management activities by deliberation on various technologies and tools organizations need to adopt and to be able and quickly and effectively identify and address risk. This workshop is segmented into two sessions, the morning and the afternoon sessions. Each session will last for 1 hour. But before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. This workshop will be recorded and made available on Richflood's YouTube channel. All participants are in listening-only mode. You can rename yourself and add your organization after your name in brackets so that you can be properly identified. Also, poll questions will be utilized throughout the seminar. We appreciate your participation. Let me also inform us that we all have the opportunity to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and our speakers will address them during the question and answer session at the end of each presentation. To do this, kindly utilize the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen on a computer and at the top of the screen for tablet device users. Please also do well to include your name and location alongside your questions and comments. Thank you. Right now, I will introduce the speaker who will be taking us through this session. The speaker for this session's presentation is Dr. Adeola Adewale Olajugbagbe. She's an environmental control and management expert. She has handled several projects on environmental assessment studies across Nigeria. She has also coordinated a good number of studies on environmental audits, environmental protection and rehabilitation program, and other studies for Richflood International Limited. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Adeola. You're welcome. The floor is yours. You can commence your presentation.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Daniel, for that introduction. Once again, welcome to this workshop. Today we have a topic before us, which is site investigation, risk assessment, and risk management. First, I would like to take us through the basic information we need to know about risk investigation, risk assessment, site investigation, risk assessment, and risk management. When we talk about risk investigation, it has to do with collection of information, assessment of data, and reporting potential hazard that is associated with a site which is yet to be discovered. Site investigation has a number of things that are associated with it. because it is important during the site investigation to gather all information about contaminant sources and expected behavior, which is needed for a complete assessment. Now, these contaminants may be present within the different media, such as soil, sediments, flora, fauna, waste, water, and they may be found in different forms, such as solid, liquid, or gaseous form. Therefore, site investigation has a number of objectives it needs to fulfill. But before we go to the objective, there are several groups. There are different stages that are in this site investigation procedure. We have the soil investigation, the geologic aspect of it, the preliminary investigation, a detailed site investigation, and even supplementary investigation and construction control. Now, the objectives of site investigation range from determination of the nature and extent of contamination, both the ones that are entering the site and the ones that are leaving the site. And another objective of site investigation is to identify any other hazard that may require an immediate action to protect either the public health or the environment quality. Also, site investigation helps to identify and characterize pathways and targets. And with this, we can have a conceptual model of the site. And with the help of site investigation, we can determine whether there is need for long-term monitoring or not. Also, site investigation provides sufficient information on all the sources of contamination and the pathway, even the target and other site-specific characteristics that will help to permit risk assessment. And finally, it helps to provide sufficient information to enable the selection of appropriate remedial action, because the aftermath of an investigation is for us to be able to profile measures to either manage the already contaminated soil or have a remediation strategy in place. Now, when we talk about risk assessment, broadly speaking, a risk assessment is the combined effort of identifying and analyzing potential events that may negatively impact an individual, an asset, or even the environment. And that we refer to as hazard analysis. And also, we say a risk assessment has to do with making judgment on the tolerability of the risk on the basis of a risk analysis, even while we are considering the influencing factor, that is risk evaluation. Now, the risk assessment of contaminated sites depends fundamentally on the data that is available about the characteristics of the site, including contaminant sources, pathways, and the potential receptors that may even be at risk. And the ultimate aim of the site investigation is to provide appropriate and reliable data against which to assess risk to chosen receptors, which may either be humans, it could be water environment, it could be the flora or fauna, it could be the buildings or even structures. Therefore, site investigation is very important when we talk about contamination. And then risk assessment now provides an objective and technical evaluation of the likelihood of unacceptable impact to human health and the environment. And we need to put into consideration the various categories of risk that exist, because this is going to help to decide which problem needs to be dealt with most urgently. And the process of this decision-making and its consequent action is what we refer to as risk management, which we will still touch upon very shortly. Now, there are several objectives of risk assessment as well. And then I'm going to touch upon just 3 of them. First, to know the characteristics of soil and chemical contaminants affecting risk assessment of contaminated land, and to know the practical steps involved in identifying and qualifying the pollutant hazard, and also to know the risk assessment tools and framework to be adopted in the management of contaminated land. Now, having gone through the site investigation and the risk assessment process, now this is going to lead us to environmental site assessment, which is a process of evaluating the environmental liability of a site or an asset. Specifically, this environmental site assessment, which for short I would use ESA for, is the process of conducting all appropriate and required inquiry into the past and present uses of a property to determine the environmental condition at the end of the day. And this ESA is an essential part of due diligence because it will help to identify the existence and scope of soil or groundwater contamination on a particular property or on an environment. For instance, the source or the scope or the extent of the contamination might be from petroleum, or it could be from heavy metals, it could be from the use of pesticides or herbicides, and so on and so forth. And it would also help us to address both the underlying factor that has caused the contaminant and also make the property at the end of the day useful in the future. Now, environmental assessment is very crucial in remediation of contaminated properties. And when we say contaminated sites or contaminated properties, what exactly are we talking about? A property is considered contaminated if there are enough pollutants present to be potentially harmful to humans or the environment. And contamination is usually the result of unsound practices at commercial or industrial sites where hazardous materials have been manufactured or stored, or where they have even been used in the past. And the careless waste disposal, fuel spill, or leakages from storage tanks are often to blame for this contamination. You see, the materials that are being used in this industrial sites, they are in most cases dangerous and hazardous, because when there is spill, for instance, these things seep into the soil and goes into the groundwater and even other buildings and causes lots of havocs, such as explosions, unpleasant odors, and all of that. And this could be harmful to human life or even the environment. And even in extreme cases, this may cause the soil to lose its ability to retain water or even recycle nutrients. And we have so many of these toxic substances in our environment, which has been caused as a result of industrial sites and the carelessness of the personnel that are handling the operations at these sites. Now, there are three main phases of environmental site assessments, which I'm going to touch on during this workshop: the phase 1, the phase 2, and the phase 3. Environmental site assessment starts with phase 1, and this has to do with visual historical inspection. Now, it has a lot to do with the visual evidence of actual or potential contamination, such as underground storage tanks, which are usually being looked out for during this phase 1 assessment. Now, at this stage, a consultant, for instance, Richflood, will collect documents and also take area photographs to determine past activities on the site and on the neighboring properties from which migration may have migrated, from which contamination may have migrated. Now, it is important to note that even if a particular property has not experienced development before in terms of having an industrial facility on it, before something else is being introduced, it is possible that this contamination migrates from another environment and comes to contaminate this particular soil. So phase one searches and it goes back to as far as possible to determine what the property and the neighboring lands were used for and whether contamination was possible. So even if a site that appears perfectly clean today looks very all right, there is nothing going on, there has never been an industry, it could have been previously housed by a gas station or whatever that we do not even know about, which is why this phase one of the environmental site assessment is important to determine the history of that particular location and even the neighboring environment, and the presence or likely presence of hazardous substances or even petroleum products, whether on the property or around the property, or that might have been released to the environment under whatever condition, can actually pose a threat to the usage of that property at the present moment. So that is why in this phase one of environmental site assessment, we have something we call the historical assessment that we conduct, because this will help to get the past occurrences and also check out if any of them have been addressed before introduction of a new thing into the property. And this investigation, this phase of the investigation is conducted following the American Society for Testing and Material Standards, which conform to all appropriate inquiry standards. Now, there are some activities that are involved in phase one of environmental site assessment. I've talked a lot already about the historical record of the property. So the first thing is a thorough review of historical records of the property, including historical aerial photographs, fire insurance mapping, whatever information you are able to get on the property, and also a thorough review of the readily available government environmental records, such as maybe you can have the environmental records that are available maybe by the Federal Ministry of Environment or the NOSDRA or what have you. Any agency could make any of this information available. Also, another activity that is crucial at this stage of the ESA is interview with current and past property occupants. Current and past occupants, because this will help to know what the property was used for before your own introduction into the environment. And a thorough inspection, including all the buildings, the interior, the exterior, every aspect. So like I said earlier at the beginning of this phase one, it has a lot to do with visual inspection and review of documents that are available on the property. Now, once the phase one of the ESA is complete, the environmental professional will summarize what concerns were identified on the property and make recommendations about what actions that is required to address the concerns that has been identified. And there are some high-risk activities that could even serve as source of site contamination. Like I mentioned, some of them, we have them listed up here. It could be an oil and petroleum extraction, processing, transport, or even distribution. You know, that could lead to an oil spill or what have you. Then manufacturing, if there was a manufacturing industry in that area before, it could also be a source of contamination. And we have them, the minerals and metals extraction and processing as well. Because during all these procedures, during the extraction processes and even the processing of the minerals, some chemicals are usually being made use of, and these things could contaminate the environment. We have the wastewater treatment, contaminated soil processing, pulp and paper manufacturing, cement and asphalt manufacturing. We have them on and on like that. Now, this will take us to the phase 2 environmental site assessment. This is usually done to assess actual presence of environmental contaminants. Remember earlier the phase 1, I said it is being conducted to assess whatever impact or whatever contamination that must have happened in the past. It has to do with history. While the phase 2 has to do with assessment of the actual presence of environmental contaminants. And the purpose of this is to determine the presence or absence of either petroleum products or hazardous waste, either on the surface of the environment, or even you determine the condition of the groundwater, the condition of the soil, you determine the condition of all the environmental components in that environment. And when designing a phase 2 environmental site assessment, the most important pieces of information that are necessary are the areas of concern, the chemicals of concern, the local geology, the site access issues. All these things need to be considered while conducting a phase 2 ESA. And some of the baseline data gathering that are involved in phase 2 of the ESA include soil and water sampling for signs of contamination. I said earlier, all the environmental components need to be assessed. They need to be sampled, they need to be studied for us to determine the extent and the scope of contamination at that present moment. And not just conducting the analysis of this water and the soil, but to also compare the results that is being obtained after the analysis with the local guidelines, if there is any, the state guidelines, and the federal regulatory guidelines, and even the international guidelines. Now, there are standards and there are limits that has already been provided by all these regulatory bodies. So the results obtained from the data collection of that site needs to be compared. They need to be compared. And they may also include some interior inspection or identification of wetland, identification of endangered species that may prevent certain land users from accessing the environment. So at this stage, there are quite a number of monitoring equipment that will be used for the phase 2 ESA, like the ground penetrating radar units, like the survey equipment, that like the photo ionization detectors, the auger, the mud rotary, the push probes, and all of that. There are so many equipment that are going to be made use of during this phase 2 assessment. And now we'll go to the phase 3 assessment. A phase 3 ESA allows parties involved to develop a plan of remediation, which needs to have an approval of the local, the state, and the federal environmental agencies. It will also detail a full scope of option for all the parties, as well as the time, the costs that will be involved in the cleanup. And this phase 3 ESA is usually called for only when contamination has been identified. Either from the phase 1 contamination was identified, or it was at the phase 2 contamination has been identified. This phase 3 now comes in. But if there is no identification of any form of contamination, then the process is going to stop maybe at phase 2. But now you proceed to phase 3 after identification of contamination. And this phase 3 assessment determines the extent of contamination, both horizontally and vertically. And this phase 3 forms the basis for preparing the remediation plan and also estimating the time and the cost that is going to be spent on the remedial actions. And also at this stage, there are certain tests that will be conducted to still ascertain the presence of contaminants, on a particular site. And now, it is important for us to know that contamination in soil has a number of effects, or contamination in our water, contamination of the environment generally has a number of hazards that it causes, both to the environment and even to the human health. We have a number of them displayed on our screen. Now, by the time this environmental component becomes contaminated, the soil, for instance, they are going to be absorbed by the crops that we plant. There are farming practices all around, and when the soil is contaminated, the plants takes in this contaminant. And when it is time for harvest, we make the harvest, and we consume these things and ingest contaminant as well. Or if the contaminant, I said it could be in different forms. It could be solid, it could be liquid, and it could be gaseous. So if it is gaseous contamination, for instance, now, it is going to be inhaled. And we have other hazards like the skin contact, contamination of the water resources. We already talked about that, contamination of the soil. And sometimes there could even be an explosion. And also it affects the lifespan of a property. Now, after we must have, gone through all those things, the site investigation, the risk assessment, and we have done the ESA, whether the phase 1, 2, and 3, what do we need to do? And this will take us to risk management. Risk assessment, as we said earlier, is based on considering linkages between the sources, the pathways, and the receptors. Now, these pollutant linkages, they are useful not just in assessing risk from contamination, but also understanding them in order for us to determine the key ones. I said earlier that after assessment and identifying these contaminants, we need to determine which one requires urgent attention first. And at the end of everything, we have gone through the sources, we know the pathway, we have been able to identify the receptor. Now, what are the remedial actions that we need to take? We need to have a design, we need to have a structure for effective remediation. And then these three things are the basic information that we need to know on the risk management. That is the source, the pathway, and the receptor. And now, for source, we look at the control. The pathway, we look at how to manage it, how to manage the situation, because it has already left the source, right? And is going through the pathway. But at the source, we have to look for means to abate at the source. These are ways we can develop our remedial actions. These are some of the remedial actions that we need to come up with. We need to find a way to control it at the source, while at the pathway, we need to find a way to manage it. Because contamination may exist at point sources, and then they could vary. It could be a long-term thing, it could be a short-term thing. But the moment we know the source of this contamination, it is important for us to find a way to put an end to it. If we cannot stop it completely, we should find a way to reduce it or modify the sources. Now, if it has gone through and it is now on the pathway, now we have to look for a way to manage the pathway. And the approaches that we may want to adopt at this stage may include having barriers such as having impermeable, maybe bentonite walls driven through an aquifer, just to manage the contaminant that has already left the source. Because this kind of thing would reduce the flow of groundwater so that the rate at which contaminant is transferred to the receptor would be reduced. So now, if, for instance, we have been able to manage it, and then we have to quickly go to the receptor and find a way to protect it. We have to find it. It's not just enough we stop it or we modify it or we reduce it at the source. It's not just enough we manage it at the pathway, but even the receptor, we need to have a way to protect the receptor. Now, risk management at the point of the receptor involves altering of behavior or even the presence of receptor in some way so as to reduce the risk to which they are being subjected to. And the most common example of this is recognizing some limitations to the use of land to avoid particular pathways. We can limit the use of the thing so that in a way we'll be able to avoid, or we can have a schedule for its usage. We can have a schedule for its usage. And as a short-term action, removal of receptors, if it is possible, we can do that as well. The most important thing for us to just know is that risk management is a process of deciding how pollutant linkages might be most effectively and efficiently broken, and then undertake the actions that are required to manage the entire situation at the end of the day. Now, with this, I'm going to round up by saying that enhancement of site investigation and strengthening of risk analysis is what we do at Richflood International Limited. We can help with the site investigation. We help with the ESA phases of remediation process for the site investigation of remediation actions for us to manage the contaminated site at the end of the day. And Richflood helps clients make better and faster decisions about contaminated sites and risk management activities. Thank you very much. Over to you, the moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Adiola, for that wonderful and illuminating presentation. Actually, we received some couple of questions from our participants during the course of your presentation. But before that, let me quickly take a summary of what was discussed by our speaker. Our speaker spoke on the topic site investigation and risk assessment, and we're enlightened on the nature and extent of every form of contamination. And from our presentation, we also learned about the various objectives of this site investigation and why is it necessary for corporations or organizations to embark on site investigation and assessing the risks associated with this site. And we all know that this site investigation will go a long way in enabling us to know the nature or extent of any form of contamination, and it also enables us to identify the various hazards needing immediate action. And as we all know that this risk management can be done at 3 different phases or stages. It can be done managed at the source, at the pathway, and at the receptor. I will start with the first question I have here from one of our participants. The question says, what types of hazard or risks should you look for in a site investigation and risk assessment? What types of hazards or risks you should look out for in a site investigation and risk assessment? have another question here. It says, please share more light on REC recognized environmental condition. This is coming from one of our participants. Say, please share more light on REC recognized environmental condition. And then I have another question here. It says, what are the factors to be considered when undertaking a site investigation? If you want to embark on a site investigation, what are the factors you should take into consideration as you carry out this exercise? Okay, Dr. Adiola, you can respond to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Let me start from the way I noted it down. Some of the REC examples of the recognized environmental conditions, okay? We have the underground storage tanks, or probably the leaking underground storage tanks, automobile salvage, some metal plating facilities, and anything that you just have in the environment that that could actually cause spill, and they are hazardous in nature. Okay, so that is the first question I'm going to attend to. The second question that asked about the required information in a site investigation. Okay, I started with that when I shed light firstly on the terminology of our topic of today. So I'm just going to go over it again. Now, the site investigation has to do with collecting information and assessment of data. Now, it involves collation of desktop information, appraisal of data, assessment of the ground conditions, and provision of an interpretative report. So specifically, when we say collection of information, appraisal of data, now in this case, there are different types of contaminants, and there are different media in which we can find them, such as the soil, the sediments, the flora, the fauna. So if you want to determine in this case, you go to those environmental components and you collect data from them in order for you to determine the scope and extent of or presence of contaminants in each of those environmental components. I'm not sure I got what was the first question you asked?
The typical hazard in the possible hazards.
Okay. The possible hazards and risk that you should look out for in investigating a site. Okay, thank you very much. I said earlier, this hazard and risk, they are categorized based on their magnitude. They're categorized based on their magnitude. Now, there could be an hazard or there could be a risk already in a groundwater. There could be in the groundwater, there could be in the soil, there could be even in the air. So when you are looking out for risk, you are looking out for hazard, you look out for the potential of those components of being, or the potential of those components being contaminated. Those are the things you look out for. So basically, it will still link you up to the environmental media. That's, you talk about the soil, you talk about the air, you talk about the water, and the biodiversity. Okay, over to you, Morgan.
Okay, Dr. Adiola, thanks for your response. Just received another question here. It says, how long does a site investigation and risk assessment typically take? How long does it take to conduct a site investigation and risk assessment? Okay. All right, over to you.
Okay, now speaking about the duration, the duration has a lot to do with the presence of contaminants in the environment first. There could be a risk assessment that you might conduct and not spend, maybe let's say you spend a week planning it, you go to the field and you spend few more weeks and you conduct the risk assessment and your site investigation. But really, it has a lot to do with, first, the presence of contaminants in the environment. Secondly, it has to do with what are the contaminants that you discovered or that you identified during your site investigation and risk assessment. And third, what is the rating? Is it at a minimal level, or it is at an average level, or it is, it is going to cause a very great risk? So the ratings, the type of contaminants you discover, the presence, and all of those things are what you put together. So you can't just say categorically it's going to take you 2 weeks, and at the end of the day, you spend 1 month, you spend 2 months there. I hope that answers your question. Over to you.
All right, Dr. Adiola, thanks for that response. And also thank you, and it's been great having you in our midst today. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. We also look forward to having you with us again. On behalf of Richflood International, the organizer of this event, I want to say thank you to all our participants for attending this morning's session. We are confident that your understanding of site investigation, risk assessment, and management has been broadened, and we look forward to having you join us at 3 p.m. for the afternoon session of this workshop. Please, should you have further questions and contributions, kindly forward them to info@richflood.com. But before we leave, I would like each and every one of us to turn off their cameras so we can take a group photograph for this session, this morning's session. Put on your videos, your cameras, so we can have a screenshot. Okay. All right. Thank you. I can see some of us are on, while some are still yet to put on their cameras. Yes. I can see Dr. Adiola, Emmanuel, Chris Ijeoma is here. Thank you. Mr. Ojo Sunday, thank you. Mr. Ukeme Yelu, I can see you. Abdul Rashid Akinola, Sietu Aliyu Kende Adekunle, you are welcome. I appreciate you being here. Amanam is here too. Ariayo, Bachi Yunana, yes, I can see you. Barrister Jude too, you're welcome. Clarence Obi Shoba is here too. Clement Ali, it's a pleasure having you here too. Can see Emmanuel Orohoro. Thank you. Eniola Einaya Ibe. We have Mrs. Esther Njoku. You're welcome. Faith Ihoma is also part of us. We have Francis Itambu, Francisca Oyiya. Also have Hannah Sunday. You're welcome. Ishaya Joel is also in our midst. We have Jacob Nenkri Matthew. Can see you too. Kelechi Juliet and Jeffrey Osunde is also in our midst. You're all welcome. Thank you for coming. Muyiwa Odele, you are here too. We have Nesria Ogun. I think he's a representative from Nesria Ogun State. I have Mr. Olu, Mr. Osezino, Mr. Paruse. I have Mr. Peter K. Agabwe, also part of us. Thank you for coming. Prince Lekon, Fadina, Rita Babatunde, you're all welcome. Thank you for coming. Charity Ibrahim is also part of us. We have a representative from FRSC Nigeria, that's SRCSS Coco. So here we have Mr. Isaac Julius too. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you during our afternoon section of this workshop. Okay, thank you. Until then, have a nice day.